the recording. So metabolic syndrome really at its heart is about energy balance. And you've probably all heard this when talking about obesity, energy in versus energy out. And it really does come down to that simple equation that a person's weight, a person's metabolism is based on energy intake, calories that come into the body, and energy expenditure, calories that are used by the body. However, as we've looked more and more and more into this question of metabolism and what factors control calories in and calories out, it's not simply how much food do you eat and how much exercise do you get. That was kind of, back in the 70s, that's what everybody thought. There were all these low-fat diets because fat has more calories than sugar. And just get people moving, 30 minutes a day. But there's a lot more that goes into it. So nutrition is definitely a big factor. But as I just mentioned, sleep. And so your appetite, and not just your appetite, but how you use calories when they get into the body, how they are metabolized by your cells, depends on how much sleep you've gotten. Because it's related to circadian rhythms. Your hormones, most of your hormones in your body have a natural circadian rhythm that are programmed expecting about an 8-hour sleep cycle during dark. And when that doesn't happen, things get thrown off. There's a lot of metabolic diseases that are more prevalent in people who do shift work, like nurses, because they alter their circadian rhythms. So sleep is also important. Yes?
Does everyone have the exact same circadian rhythm?
No. The question is, does everybody have the exact same circadian rhythm? And there are individual differences in circadian rhythms. The circadian rhythm is encoded by the hypothalamus, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus in particular has a natural clock. So the cells in that part of the brain they have a natural phosphorylation and degradation process that controls the secretion of other hormones within the hypothalamus, and that controls other body systems through hormonal signaling. Now, some people have a naturally longer sleep cycle. If they put people in caves, and they really did do this, they put people in caves, and just they see how long they sleep and when they sleep. And so some people will sleep 9 to 10 hours if given the opportunity. Some people will only sleep 6 to 7 hours. But the majority of people will settle in around an 8-hour sleep cycle. What's really interesting is that when they choose to sleep can be shifted. So we all know that there are night owls and early birds, and that actually is physiologically encoded. That some people, their circadian rhythm naturally starts at 4 or 5 a.m. Some people, they just cannot get up and get going until 9 or 10 a.m. And that's biologic. That's not, your mom will always say, why don't you get up earlier? Why don't you get up earlier? The other really interesting fact is that it changes across your lifespan. Anybody here have young children? They get up really early. And then as they get older and get more towards teenagers have a naturally delayed sleep cycle. And then when you get to be in the elderly, they tend to have shorter sleep cycles, and again, it shifts back to early wakefulness. I read a really interesting book called Go Wild, and it's talking a little bit about our genetics and our evolutionary history and how that all plays together. And the suggestion was that people naturally have these different changes in circadian rhythms because evolutionarily, when we were sleeping among predators, it was beneficial to have some people who stayed up late at night naturally and helped keep predators away, and other people who naturally got up more early, so that around the clock there was always somebody from a tribe awake to be ready to go. It's a hypothesis, but I found that really interesting to explain this natural variation in humans in their circadian rhythms. Yeah? Is there a consequence to sleeping too long? It's a really good question, and there's been a little bit of research on it. So people who sleep hypersomnia, it's like sleeping, I think, more than 10 hours a day, tend to be more depressed, and depression is linked to more morbidity and mortality. But independent of mental health, longer sleep deprivation or longer sleep duration has been, in a few studies, linked to some forms of cancer or other diseases. Now, it's not clear if that's because of reduced activity. People who are sleeping longer tend to just have greater sedentary lifestyles, or if there's something about the actual extended sleep time that's involved in that process. But it's a really good question. Most people find it hard, unless you've stayed up and you're chronically sleep deprived, it's really hard to sleep more than 10 hours every single night. Most people find that, but some people do. Yes?
So since you're like a parent, if your sleep is like different than your children, aren't you sleep deprived?
Yes. The question is, if you're a parent and your sleep schedule is different than your children's, aren't you sleep deprived? Yes.
So wouldn't that like mess up your metabolic?
And it does. What's really interesting is that women who nurse and co-sleep tend to synchronize their sleep schedules with their babies. And so for a long time, the American Pediatric Association frowned on co-sleeping. They did not want moms to sleep with their babies, even though that was evolutionarily the norm, and in most countries in the world, that's the norm. But the thought was moms are going to roll on top of their babies and smother them. It happened once or twice. And it does happen more frequently if a parent is under sedative medication or alcohol. And so the recommendation was just not to sleep with your babies. But if you don't sleep next to your baby, especially if you're formula feeding and not nursing, the moms and the babies become out of sync, and the mothers get extremely sleep deprived. And that has a big effect on mood, so it increases postpartum depression. It has a big effect on appetite. So weight loss after pregnancy can be very challenging, and it's exacerbated in women who aren't sleeping enough because of that link up there. So there is that relationship. And I think personally, I co-slept with my children, and I think that's a much more natural way of sleeping and keeping yourself healthy and sane so that you can be a better parent to your children. APA has now changed their position, and now they do recommend that your child sleep at least in the same room with you for the first 12 months. So it's always hard to know when to listen to recommendations and when to just go with your own gut. I tend to go with my gut. Good question. All right. Okay, so the last component I was going to mention in terms of what affects energy balance is mood, and that we know depression and anxiety are related to metabolic dysfunction in many ways. I'm not going to talk much about it today, but just be aware that that's also a factor in energy metabolism. And again, it's because the body is really a big unit. There's a great book if you're interested in mind-body connections called Molecules of Emotion. And this is a biologist who has spent her life studying endocrine signals and the communication between the brain and the rest of the body. So there is a lot of connection going on there. Yes?
What's the yellow thing in the diagram?
This right here?
Yep.
That's the pancreas. Oh yeah, this is the pancreas, you're right. This is adipose tissue then. So this is liver, muscle, fat, and pancreas, and here's the GI tract. So these are all organs that are involved in energy metabolism in some way. So I think it was in the 80s they discovered the obesity gene. and it was leptin. I think it was a leptin receptor, and they were able to genetically engineer mice that became obese even if they're fed the same diet as normal or wild-type mice. And so that led a big interest in the genetics of obesity and the genetics of metabolism, and that with the same food intake, not everybody metabolizes calories the same way. It doesn't mean that energy intake, food intake isn't important, but there is definitely a genetic component to how you metabolize food. Partially, this is encoded by your actual genes, but a lot of this is actually regulated by epigenetics. Who can tell me what epigenetics is? Yes?
Doesn't the environment and your surroundings affect your genetics?
Exactly. So the environment and your behaviors, your environmental exposures can actually affect your genetics. How could it do that? It changes gene expression. It changes gene expression by actually not modifying the sequence of your DNA, but by modifying the histone, the proteins that are around the DNA. And by doing so, they can make that sequence of DNA inaccessible so that it basically turns it off without actually causing mutations. So our life exposures can influence which genes in our body are turned on and off. And that seems to be heritable. So they were looking, I think it was in Holland, during World War II, there was a big food shortage. And subsequently, the offspring of women who experienced food shortage during World War II in the Netherlands had a higher rate of obesity in their children. And they have done some studies to link it to epigenetics, changes in genes that regulate energy metabolism. Basically saying there's not much food around, you have to use and store every calorie you get. And that can actually change how a person processes their calories. And then if that person is in a condition where access to food is plentiful, that metabolic encoding is no longer beneficial, but actually maladaptive. So I think this is a burgeoning field. It's really interesting. Yes? And there's a lot of research going into epigenetics because while epigenetics can be environmentally induced, they can also be changed. So you can actually reverse epigenetic changes as well. How do we do that is a big question. Mm-hmm.
So I was going to ask, if you get more sleep, your metabolism is better, and you're not going to be overweight with like hypothyroidism. I know it's a metabolic thing and it screws that up, but you sleep more if you're not diagnosed and regulated, and you also gain weight more.
Yep. So your question is, why do you sleep more and gain weight with hyperthyroidism? It has to do with energy metabolism. So the thyroid hormone affects how your cells metabolize glucose and fat. So you gain weight because you basically don't burn fat as much. The thyroid signals your body to increase fat stores. Hypothyroid signals increase fat stores. Thyroid hormone signals increase metabolism. So if you don't have enough thyroid, you don't burn as much fat, you store that fat for later. I don't know all of the specifics behind it, but thyroid hormone, basically there's receptors on almost all of the cells of your body. It's circulating in your blood all the time, and it has effects both on the brain and on all the individual cells of your body. So I think the effects on sleep are regulated through its signals to the brain, and the effects on weight are signaled through its effects on metabolism, the mitochondrial function in the cells. Mm-hmm. And we'll do hypo and hyperthyroidism when we get to the endocrine system. But it definitely is involved in this process. And then I'm just going to mention, because you know I love microbiome, here's another factor, another layer that has recently been discovered to be involved in this whole energy balance equation. So in the early 2000s, there were some studies that came out looking at the type of bacteria people have in their digestive tract. And the type of bacteria people have is correlated with obesity. And when they looked closer, they actually found that if you have more Firmicutes and less, what was it? Can't remember what the other genus is. But if you have more species that are in the Firmicutes family, you extract more calories from your food and absorb more calories. So independent of how much you eat, independent of your own physiology, your bacteria that are in your digestive tract can influence how much calories you get from the food you eat. So two people could eat exactly the same diet, and one person will get more calories from it than another person because of the microbiome. And that's just one example. They're doing more and more research to understand the link between the microbiome and obesity and a whole bunch of other diseases, related diseases. So I think those are all important factors to keep in mind into what's controlling energy balance. Yes?
When you take a lot of antibiotics and you don't go on to probiotics,
Yes.
is there a way to restore that afterwards?
So the question is, if you take a lot of antibiotics and then you don't take probiotics right away, how do you restore your microbiome? And it's currently a big topic of research. Now that we know the microbiome is so important in a lot of different aspects of health, how do we alter that microbiome? Antibiotics definitely have a big effect. They wipe out a lot of your bacteria, both good and bad. And what's really remarkable is that most people will eventually go back to the same composition of their microbiome that they had before they took antibiotics. Probably because most of the microbes you're exposed to come from your food and come from your environment, and that doesn't change very frequently in people's lives. So the biggest way to alter your microbiome is to alter your diet and to change your environmental exposures, because that's where your bacteria come from. We don't know enough yet to be able to say what is the best way to do it. But I think it's going to be really important. And you can look at Whole Foods, there's tons of different formulas of probiotics out there, all with different health claims. But quite honestly, we don't really know what is the best way to restore, or it's called microbiome rehabilitation. But I think it's an up-and-coming field. So let's talk about metabolic syndrome. It's weird because metabolic syndrome isn't really a disease, yet we diagnose people as having metabolic syndrome. But metabolic syndrome is a constellation of clinical findings. And here is showing you some of the clinical findings that tend to go together. And more importantly, the more of these clinical findings that a person has, the greater their risk of cardiovascular disease, greater than just simply adding them together. So in this one, having high triglycerides and low HDL. Remember, HDL was good cholesterol. So if you have high triglycerides and low good cholesterol, you're at increased risk of atherosclerosis, which puts you at increased risk for coronary artery disease, and having a heart attack. If you have this and you have inflammation from maybe leaky gut syndrome, so you have something going on with the microbiome, or let's say you have an autoimmune disease, anything that can trigger systemic inflammation, now it's not just an additive effect, but it's a exponential effect. So the other aspect that's really important about metabolic syndrome is that each factor tends to increase your risk for the other factors as well. So altogether, they increase your risk for mortality, primarily through cardiovascular disease. But individually, they increase your risk for other components of metabolic syndrome. So that a person who has hypertension, for example, may then be at risk for developing high triglycerides and then may be at risk for hyperglycemia and diabetes. They tend to spiral together like that. So in order to diagnose somebody with metabolic syndrome, there's a list of criteria. Obesity is one of the factors, and so you can measure that by waist circumference or, oops, no thank you, Siri, or BMI, body mass index. So BMI used to be the big important factor because it was an overall measure of weight relative to height. However, they started realizing that abdominal obesity is more dangerous than general obesity. And so waist circumference is now the main factor being used to diagnose metabolic syndrome. Triglycerides. So in the blood, triglycerides are transported around. Increased triglycerides, which are fat molecules that have a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acid chains. So high blood levels of that is a component of metabolic syndrome. Low HDL cholesterol, so low good cholesterol. And remember that when they say cholesterol, these are really transport particles that contain both triglycerides and cholesterol, as well as lipoproteins. And so the high-density lipoprotein carrying cholesterol is bringing it back to the liver for excretion. So it's getting rid of extra cholesterol and triglycerides in the body. So that's why it's a good cholesterol. Hypertension, defined as high blood pressure. And so this is greater than 130 systolic or 85 diastolic. And then high glucose. So there's a whole bunch of different criteria schemes for how you can label somebody as having metabolic syndrome. World Health Organization has one. For them, insulin sensitivity is the number one factor. You have to have insulin sensitivity and any 2 of the other features. In the US, we mostly use this one. This is the National Cholesterol Education Program. And so they really started this idea of metabolic syndrome and set forth criteria. And those criteria have been refined over the years. But basically, they say you have any 3 of those 5 features, clinical findings, calls it metabolic syndrome. It used to be, I think it was increased waist circumference plus 2. The criteria keep changing. But what's important is that it's always related to these factors over here. I'm just going to move that out of the way for a second. Basically, that you have some degree of insulin resistance, which is related to high blood sugar, increased body weight, and increased lipids and high blood pressure. Yes?
What does the APOE stand for on the last slide?
Thanks. So it used to be thought that fat was just storage cells. You had these cells, they stored extra triglycerides until they were needed by the body, in which case the cells released them as free fatty acids or triglycerides to go back into the liver to be turned into glucose or to go into other cells of the body to be used as a fuel source. We now know that that is only one function of fat, but fat also is hormonally very active. So fat is involved in estrogen metabolism, It's also involved in regulation of fat metabolism and regulation of appetite. Those factors occur through leptin. Leptin is a hormone that's secreted by fat cells, specifically higher amounts by visceral fat. What's the difference between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat? Anybody know? Anatomically. It's like visceral is what? Yeah, so they're in different body cavities or body layers. And I'll come back to this. That's a great question. What causes fat to be deposited in the visceral cavity versus in the subcutaneous? And I don't have an answer. I bet there is research out there on what factors go into that. And it's probably related to many of the hormones and other things that we've already talked about, circadian rhythms, things like that. But I don't know the specific pathways. But I think that's a really good question. Yeah?
So when somebody has liposuction, are they only taking out subcutaneous fat? Or
Yes, yes. Liposuction is taking out the subcutaneous fat. So it's cosmetic. Yes?
Is one type easier to work off than the other?
Ooh, good question. Is one type easier to work off than the other? I don't know. That's another good question. So, what causes it to be deposited and then what causes it to be burnt off? And both of them are burnt off if you eat less calories, change your diet, and exert more physical activity. But I don't know what ratio and what factors control whether you're going to lose abdominal fat first or subcutaneous fat first. I think and there's probably some individual variability that go into both of those sides of the equation as well. But yeah, a good question.
Can you surgically remove visceral fat to control that hormone?
I don't know that they've been doing that yet. So you know that weight reduction surgery is actually stapling the stomach, trying to reduce the amount of calories that a person can take in. We now know that actually has huge effects on the microbiome, and it doesn't actually work long-term very effectively. But I haven't heard of any surgeries to actually remove visceral fat.
Is that just because it's more risky around the organs?
It might be that it's more risky. I'm sure that there are people trying to develop those procedures, but the simplest and less risky approach is to modify lifestyle factors. Yes?
What do you adipokines?
Adipokines?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so these are hormones that act kind of like cytokines that are released from fat cells. So they call them adipokines because they come from adipocytes. And they activate the inflammatory response. So with the release of adipokines, you have an increase in interleukin-1, which remember is one of the primary cytokines related to the innate immune system and inflammation. So it seems like they can activate macrophages, and they can alter macrophages between the different types of cytokines that macrophages release to increase inflammation. So a person who has more visceral fat is more prone to inflammation because they already have a lot of these cytokines flowing around in their system, and they already have activated macrophages. So it's thought to be related to systemic inflammation, which, remember, inflammation was also involved in atherosclerosis. Just a second. bringing us to the next slide. So inflammation really, you've heard me say this in probably every lecture so far, because inflammation is now seeming to be at the root of almost all chronic health conditions that we've talked about. It's been involved in cancer, it's been involved in heart disease, and vascular disease. It triggers glomerular disease and interstitial nephritis. So inflammation is really kind of what ties together the body, which makes a lot of sense because the immune system is a systemic organ in a way and travels all throughout the body. So anything that's happening in one area through inflammation is going to affect other areas of the body. And so this is just showing you how obesity through these adipocytes, like I was just mentioning, can actually activate macrophages. And there's this two-way street where macrophages can be activated by adipokines, but then they secrete more cytokines that actually increase the hormonal activity of adipocytes. And then the same thing happens in the liver. So this is fatty liver, where when the hepatocytes start to undergo fatty change, remember that's a response to injury. These cells are becoming injured. And that triggers the Kupffer cells, which are the macrophages that live in the liver, to become activated, and they start to release cytokines. So a lot of these cytokines, like TNF, interleukin-1, you've heard about before, and they become released into the systemic circulation and can have effects on other parts of the body. So again, this is the putting together all of the components through activation of the immune system. Where did I put it? You'll hear the term dyslipidemia. And if you go back and look at the diagnostic criteria, it was elevated triglycerides or a low HDL, which is your bad cholesterol, or a high LDL, which is, this is your good cholesterol, and this is your bad cholesterol. So all of these components are measured, you can just measure them directly in somebody's blood. So the blood carries cholesterol and fat, again, in these lipoprotein particles, high density, low density, and then triglycerides are carried in both of these types of particles, as well as in their own little particles in the blood. So you can actually measure just the amount of triglycerides in the blood, and that independently is associated with metabolic syndrome. And when they measure total cholesterol, it's all three of these combined. And I just put this blood vessel diagram to remind us that triglycerides are important in the pathophysiology of atherosclerosis. Yes?
Can you have one issue without the other? Like, you can have high LDL but have normal HDL?
Yes.
Low HDL and high LDL?
Yes, you can. And so that's why they've changed the criteria. It used to be that it was just high cholesterol, this way, measured this way, total cholesterol. But they found that some people with high cholesterol have normal LDL, but high HDL, and that gave them a high total cholesterol level. But they were actually healthy, and because when you break it down, the high LDL or high HDL was contributing to the total cholesterol. They're in a much healthier state and much less risk of going on to develop atherosclerosis than somebody who has normal or low HDL but high LDL. So that's why they've broken it down. And you can have any one of these independently higher or lower. And I think they keep doing more and more epidemiologic studies to try to stratify risk. So now they've even broken this down into VLDL, and trying to see whether patients who have low or high VLDL are at lower or higher risk of cardiovascular diseases. Mm-hmm.
So it's okay to have high HDL levels?
It is good to have a high HDL levels, yes.
No adverse effects to having high HDL?
No. So far, the research that has been done has showed that people who have high HDL have lower atherosclerosis, lower systemic inflammation, and lower obesity. So it's correlated with healthier overall metabolism. And the thought is because LDL is a kind of a storage. It's taking cholesterol and triglycerides away from the liver where they've been stored or synthesized and depositing them in your fat and in your muscles. Whereas HDL is bringing those things away back to the liver to be metabolized or excreted. And so it's probably that it's more of an indication of somebody who's healthy, whose body is in a good state, rather than a causal reaction. Mm-hmm.
Can we eat certain types of foods or supplements to raise your HDL levels?
Yeah, so what types of food raise HDL? Do you guys remember? I think there were some oatmeal commercials, Quaker commercials, that talked about how oatmeal has been shown to decrease LDL and raise your HDL. I don't know if that's what the facts are behind that or the data is behind that, but my dad eats oatmeal every single morning, and he gets his cholesterol. He loves living in Arizona because you can actually go directly to a lab and ask them to check your cholesterol. You don't have to go through a doctor. So he does all this to himself all the time. And he found that when he started eating more oatmeal, his HDL went up. And then I made him cut out cheese, and then his total cholesterol dropped way down. His LDL actually dropped a lot. Anecdotal, I know, but there are dietary indications. So whole grains are supposed to be good for lowering LDL and raising HDL. Foods that are high in saturated fat are still linked to low HDL levels, probably because that something about the saturated fat is getting deposited and not metabolized. If you have a chronic high-fat diet, you don't need to burn off that fat. And so it just stays in your tissues and it's not shuttled back for metabolism to the liver. Exercise also has a big influence on your cholesterol levels. You used to, April, I'll get to you in just 1 second. So that's not to say that a low-fat diet is good, because remember, everybody was really into the low-fat diets. And whenever people started wanting low-fat, the food industry responded by making all of these foods have low fat. And in order to make them still palatable, they increased the amount of sugar in them. And so now sugar is the big culprit. There's a lot of research saying that high sugar diets are bad. And I think the biggest question right now is still, grains, whole grains have a lot of good health effects, but there's a lot of people who claim paleo, which is no grains, works really well for them. And so I think we're still, nutrition-wise, in a phase where there's a lot of research trying to figure out what is the optimal nutrition for modifying these risk factors of metabolic syndrome. April.
Is dyslipidemia, all of these in tandem being high levels?
Dyslipidemia is when any one of these factors is abnormal. That's a good question. Yes?
So, going back to the cholesterol, is eating a lot of eggs raise your cholesterol?
Good question. So, is eating eggs bad? Because the yolk of eggs has high cholesterol, and that was what egg whites were a big thing, that people wanted to have egg whites to have low saturated fat and low cholesterol. Well, I think that it has been pretty well shown now that dietary cholesterol does not correlate with blood cholesterol. Rather, there are dietary factors that correlate. High sugar diets and high saturated fat diets, but high dietary cholesterol doesn't seem to impact your cholesterol levels. And again, it's probably because when we measure cholesterol, blood cholesterol, we're not measuring just cholesterol. We're measuring triglycerides being transported around as well. And your body has a lot of mechanisms. So if you eat a diet that has a lot of cholesterol in it, as long as the rest of your metabolism is acting okay, you're only going to absorb what you need. And then the rest will just be excreted. So I think that plays into it. No, eggs are not going to give you high cholesterol. But everything I say could be disproven tomorrow. So unfortunately, I'm just going off what I know from the latest evidence. And as you know, that is always changing. But most likely it's not. It's okay to eat eggs. Yes?
Dyslipidemia is abnormality in the bullet points or in the top four in the box?
Well, these are the bullet points. So high triglycerides are right here, LDL and HDL. And so total cholesterol is just an accumulation of all of those. So dyslipidemia could be high triglycerides, it could be low HDL, or it could be high LDL. Or sometimes we still measure it as total cholesterol. So high total cholesterol is dyslipidemia. Maybe. And so I wanted to bring the liver into the discussion as well, because the liver plays a big role in metabolism. And this was taken from a paper in the International Journal of Molecular Science, but they were looking at things that affect the liver, and they divided into overweight and obesity and dietary sugar. So how many of you know what happens to sugar in the liver? Let's say you eat a lot of sugar. What happens to all that sugar in the liver? Yes. It gets stored there, yes. Yeah, so it gets converted into glycogen and stored for later use. So if you have high glucose, it actually gets changed. And here they're even showing that it can get made into fatty acids. And glycogen. What that does then is trigger the body to increase storage of fat. So if you eat a high sugar diet, you're actually going to increase your fat storage. And you're going to increase both subcutaneous and visceral fat. And this is also showing the link between insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. So the liver overall takes all of your different dietary components and sorts out what you need to do. And it shuttles the lipoproteins, it shuttles the stores of energy around in the body. And this is largely controlled by insulin. Now we're learning that leptin and ghrelin are involved, which are signals from fat. Insulin comes from the pancreas. So these are signaling to control metabolism of energy stores via the liver. What's the time? Do we have a 2-minute? Is it 3:20? I just can't do it. I'm sorry. I keep going and going. We could take a 2-minute break if you guys want to stretch for. Okay, 2-minute break, and then we'll come right back into glucose and diabetes. Yeah. So these AGEs are basically a little sugar residue gets stuck onto a protein, an amino acid of a protein. And that can trigger a whole bunch of different enzymatic and non-enzymatic reactions. So one thing that these advanced glycation end products does is activate something called RAGE. This is a receptor found on endothelial cells and macrophages. And when it activates that RAGE, that triggers other inflammatory cytokines to be released. It activates endothelial cells. And if you go back to when we talked about blood vessels, remember that endothelial cells, when they're activated, they become prothrombotic. They become pro-inflammatory. And you start that sequence of events leading to vessel wall damage, which is characterized by atherosclerosis. The other thing glucose can do is it can directly activate reactive oxygen species in the bloodstream. And remember that oxidative stress was a component, it's part of atherosclerosis. So oxidation of LDL particles increases their deposit within the wall of vessels. Over here, you're seeing that the advanced glycation end products are also increasing the expression of your cell adhesion molecules, CAMs, and the selectins, which were involved in leukocyte migration to a point of injury. So it's causing damage to the vessel wall. It's triggering inflammation and bringing more inflammatory cells into the area. It's oxidizing LDL. So almost all by itself, high glucose levels can cause atherosclerosis. Yes?
Would that be even throughout the body, or would that be like, I'm guessing it plays everywhere?
Yeah, yes.
Like certain spots, is that?
So that's a good question. Can that be everywhere? The exact effects are going to be different in different parts of the body, but people with diabetes, and if we probably won't get there, but the clinical sequelae of diabetes affect all of the body. So from atherosclerosis, which mainly affects the big vessels, you can get kidney disease, you can get strokes, you can get coronary artery disease. Then when we talked about the kidney, we talked about glomerular disease and how sugar in the glomerular capillaries can also cause damage. So it can cause basement membrane thickening in the capillaries of the base of the kidneys. It can cause the same thickening of the basement membrane in the retina, so you get retinopathy. You can get gangrene from the high blood sugar over time. Mostly that's through vascular disease, poor blood flow to the extremities. And then you also get neuropathy. So the mechanism by which you get neuropathy is a little bit different. It actually has to do with the sugar going into the nerve cells does not require insulin. So high blood sugar directly increases the level of glucose inside cells. Once inside a cell, the neuron, if the neuron doesn't need that much sugar, it gets changed into sorbitol or other polyols. And that increases the osmolality, so it actually can cause the cells to swell. The other thing it does is it reduces the glutathione stores and increases oxidative stress in the cells. And so that's what causes neuropathy, the damage and eventually loss of neurons throughout the body. So high blood sugar is toxic throughout the body through a variety of mechanisms. And this is why metabolic syndrome is such a big deal. Usually most studies have looked at cardiovascular disease outcomes. So heart disease is the biggest one. This is atherosclerosis in the coronary vessels that lead to a heart attack. But it's also, you can have heart failure. So this can be heart attack and heart failure related to high blood pressure. Remember that atherosclerosis increases systemic vascular resistance, so a second factor increasing the work of the heart to pump. Then you have the kidney dysfunction related to hypertension. Type 2 diabetes is the other biggest clinical consequence. Oftentimes, some people consider type 2 diabetes part of metabolic syndrome. Others say it's a downstream consequence of people who have metabolic syndrome. Ultimately, people with all of these high triglycerides, high blood pressure, tend to get type 2 diabetes if it's not corrected. The good news is prediabetes can be corrected. So if you can diagnose somebody who has metabolic syndrome before they develop type 2 diabetes, you can encourage that person to reverse those findings and prevent type 2 diabetes. But it's also linked to dementia, cancer. Polycystic ovarian syndrome it's among the top causes of infertility in women. And this is related to extra estrogen activity, probably caused by having increased stores of visceral fat. And then non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which over a long period of time, if untreated, can eventually lead to cirrhosis. So a lot of bad effects of metabolic syndrome, but totally preventable. One last study I'm going to leave you with, because I found this kind of interesting, and I know several of you are hoping to apply to the dental hygiene program. This was a link between periodontal disease, commonly known as gingivitis, and the development of metabolic syndrome. So, what do you think is the link there? Yes. Inflammation, thank you. Yes, right? This is a chronic infection. It's the most common chronic infection in the United States. All right. Exam on Thursday. Bring your laptop charged, ready to go. And I will see you guys then.